Good morning, everyone. I'm a military kid, so I like to start things on time. My name is Lisa Mathis, and I am a board member for the North Carolina Department of Transportation. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to remind you to stay engaged with our speakers, exhibitors, and social commentary throughout the summit by using our app. Please open this session in the schedule session of the app to answer the question on the screen. And the question is, why do you think diversity and inclusion are important in businesses? Is our question on the screen? Oh, it's on the screen of your app. Okay, great. Giving you a moment to make your big decision. We will also take questions from the audience for our panelists near the end of the session. We are here today to discuss how diversity and inclusion affect the transportation industry. To help us understand this better, we have Dr. Shawn Wilson, Secretary of the Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development, and Michelle Howard, Director of Small Programs for the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority. Dr. Wilson has more than 15 years of executive service at DOTD. He was appointed secretary by Louisiana Governor John Bel Edwards in 2016 and is now in his second term with the Department of Transportation and Development, where he advocates for new revenue, project innovation, and advancing a balanced and comprehensive transportation plan. He is also the vice president of AASHTO. Dr. Wilson has a BA in urban and rural planning from the University of Louisiana. Go Ragin' Cajuns. Do I understand they have the most interesting mascot?
We do.
I believe it is the only one that is based on food. Is that correct? Cayenne. Woo, go Cayenne. I completely think this is appropriate since I understand that you are a foodie.
I am a foodie.
Yes, so I do my homework. I'm just saying. It's a good thing that your gift basket is food themed. He is also the Master of Public Administration, has his Master's of Public Administration and a PhD in Public Policy from the Nelson Mandela School of Public Policy at Southern University. This is a wonderful launching point into a topic that I know you are very passionate about. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Shawn Wilson.
Someone's done their homework. So thank you, and excited to be with you. This topic, this issue, and Pam and I were just talking about the importance of this issue in terms of lifestyles and people. And so Michelle and I have partnered on this presentation. I am going to give you kind of a philosophical underpinning, a backdrop to this issue for transportation. And then we will dig deeper into some of the policy issues that will hopefully engage a really healthy discussion with you all. And so, we will talk a little bit about shifting the focus from diversity, equity, and inclusion, and being intentional about what that is. You just heard that I was now am president of AASHTO. And if you look at this slide, you will see that AASHTO, which is the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, it's an organization comprised of people much like North Carolina's DOT, representing 50 states, including Puerto Rico and Hawaii and Washington, D.C., fun places. And Bobby and I are going to make all of those state conferences, we hope. But the reality is we come from a history that has created an environment that's difficult to traverse sometimes. If you look at this slide, you see three leaders that have something in common. They all have been presidents of AASHTO. But if you look at the 108-year history, you will see something really unique. In my time as a professional in transportation, we've had our first female secretary, Susan Martinovich, my immediate predecessor, Victoria Shaheen. And guess what? Yours truly happened to be the first African-American president of an organization called the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials. That tells us something about the history of what we've done. It tells us something about the history of where we've built systems that might not have been as well thought out as we would do them today. The reality is we can't change the fact that interstates were built where they were built, that property was acquired the way it was acquired, and that families were impacted the way they were impacted. We have to learn from those things and create a better path forward. And so as AASHTO president, I've had the opportunity to create two focuses that we're going to try and have DOTs all focus on these elements as that DOT can focus. We say that creating a pathway to equity is one of the most sustainable and important things that we can do. Why is that important? Because we have an administration in Washington that's recognizing these issues and having bold conversations, but the reality is they may be there for 3 more years, they may be there for 7 years. If we are not smart, the priorities are going to change. It's going to be the next disaster, the next big thing. So for transportation departments that are so essential with connecting people, it's not just roads and bridges and infrastructure. This is about people and the opportunity that they get by interfacing with our transportation system. So I am challenging my department. By the way, I'm only the second African-American secretary in my department. And I say that not to be braggadocious, but the reality is it's a long history. You go to the U.S. Senate and look at what the diversity looks like. You go to the governor's mansions across the country and look what that diversity looks like. And for me, it's not just about race. It's about gender. It's about socioeconomic status. It's about academic experience and knowledge. It's about the ability to speak a language and be representative. And when I did my master's thesis, I talked about and defined diversity because it's a very difficult word. I said it's about being representative of the people that you serve. And so what you see in Montana, you might not get in New York. What you see in Hawaii, you're not going to get in Idaho. And so the reality is we have to be representative of those communities. And so if DOTs are smart about creating a pathway that will produce a level of leadership and a history, I think great things can happen. So that's that first priority. The second priority is partnering to deliver. Talks about how DOTs have historically operated within a vacuum. Contractors, engineers, and DOTs. It doesn't say much about our history, which is somewhat complicated and difficult at times, with mayors and local governments. It talks about how do we work with constituencies that aren't necessarily big on highways? Can you imagine that there are people who don't ever want to drive, or people who want to ride a bus? People have no choice but to ride a bus. And we think about it because we've been a highway building industry for many, many years. And probably 20 plus years ago, departments started to transition to being departments of transportation. Everything you own, buy, sell, or trade interfaces with our infrastructure system. And so we are a DOTD, Department of Transportation and Development in Louisiana, because we see that what we do is essential to developing lives, people, and businesses. So think about that. For 1 year, every DOT is being asked to focus in meaningful ways on creating pathways to equity, and we'll dig into that a little bit deeper, and partnering to deliver. How do we work better with other entities? So we all must take up this cause. If I do it, if my assistant secretary or deputy secretary does it, and none of the other 4,200 people in my department engage in this issue, guess what? We will not be successful. And the same thing happens for you. We need to take meaningful action on these issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So based on being engineers, think about the folks in the systematic processes that you do. It's got to be linear. Well, for me, diversity is an input. It's an input to everything else we do. Because if you are diverse in terms of your thinking and your approach and your delivery and your presence, you'll have more value. You'll have more buy-in. You'll have more understanding and more input. So think about diversity as being an input in everything that your Department of Transportation is going to do. Think about how do you influence the project you're working on with diversity. The second topic is equity. Equity, I will tell you, is a qualitative outcome of being diverse and doing your jobs. So if you take this approach of equity, it speaks to the quality of what you do, the value of that process. And then the third, I will tell you, is a quantitative effort. It's inclusion, because you can count those numbers. You can look around the room and say, this is a pretty diverse thing in terms of gender, in terms of age, perhaps in terms of discipline and geography. So you can look at it from a quantitative standpoint, a qualitative standpoint, or an input standpoint, meaning you're going to take this product and pour it into something else that you do. When you think about equality versus equity, many of you have seen these slides, but the term equity and equality, they sound alike, but they're quite different. Equality is giving the same resources and opportunities to everybody and expecting a fair and balanced piece. But equity is a little different. Equity says you're going to recognize where each person is and what differences they might have to deal with, and then pour resources into that. So think about it in terms of your communities. Think about it in terms of the folks that are going to use your infrastructure system. Everyone is not starting from the same place. And if we give everybody the same thing, you're certain, Manali, not to get everything the same. So let's talk about what you can do so you can get some workable tools. Well, first, I will tell you, we have to acknowledge that this is an issue. We have to have leaders who acknowledge that someone has contributions to make. And I'm thinking about it from a DOT perspective. If your executives don't think you have value or acknowledge your presence, you're going to have issues. The second thing you have to do is you have to affirm. People are looking to leaders to validate them and what they do, that they belong in the conversation, that they are a member of the team. I can't tell you how many times as secretary I've had meetings with folks and they'll say, I never thought I could go in that room and have that conversation. Validating their presence is super important if you're ever going to have diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the last big thing you have to do is you have to act. Actions speak louder than words. I will tell you, we've had more people of color with different backgrounds, different generations in my department because I've been talking about this issue since I've been secretary. When people start to see those differences, they start to feel those differences. And so actions clearly speak louder than words. And so if you as a leader can acknowledge, affirm, and act, these things can happen for you and your departments. So what will that new normal that we talk about in transportation look like? Well, just think about the decisions that you make in that environment. You can ensure that decisions and priorities are leveraged to produce greater than the contributions that you make. Just with the decisions. So operating in terms of a daily decision-making matrix, think about if you are focused on these issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion on budget decisions, on HR decisions, on project priority decisions, on strategic decisions, on legislative decisions. Having that framework, that approach, that lens will be of value. The new normal means you're using your resources differently, that you're ensuring that our contracting and our distribution of resources are fair and equitable. Why is that important? Because it's going to have a ripple effect. I'll give you an example for Louisiana. I had a DBE goal of 8.4% when I became secretary, about $1 billion budget. We're upwards of $2 billion now. And every year, we strategically increase that goal, and we'd never make it. But 6 years later, we're at a 15.3% goal. We've exceeded it with a $2 billion budget. That's important because those dollars that we're putting out in those communities are going back to the communities where they live. Imagine what will happen if every dollar we take, and this is a part of what Buy America is about, we don't want to just offshore our resources, we want to spend money here in our own country. The same thing happens with DOTs. Think about the billions of dollars that we're going to spend and what parts of our community will never be a part of that. That's how you create value and wealth. And then the benefits that you're going to have with this new normal. You're going to expand the benefits of project development and delivery much greater than what you've ever done. because you're opening the doors of opportunity for communities that we're no longer going to divide with infrastructure, that we can connect them with infrastructure, that you can provide a place for businesses to flourish and grow. And then your workforce. You all have struggled, we have struggled with a workforce. We can't find people. We don't have the workforce to get the work done. If you really embrace this issue of diversity, think about where you're looking. If you're going to go out and find engineers and you only go to the same schools you've always gone to, you will only get the results that you've always gotten. Think about your HBCUs. Think about other universities. Think about other disciplines. When I moved to the department, our communications director was an engineer. Our HR director was an engineer. They weren't trained for that, but it was an insular approach. And guess what? We're struggling to get engineers now because we did not build a workforce and cast a much larger net in terms of bringing people to this table. So think about that in terms of the decisions you make. Think about it in terms of the resources that we get to expend in our communities. Think about it in terms of the benefits that are going to be afforded to the constituents that you serve. And then last but not least, think about the benefits to your workforce. Because we always have people come back, we've got work to do. You're right, we do have work to do. But if you diversify that umbrella and change that workforce, that work becomes a lot easier. So your new normal, delivering this new normal, will empower people. It will challenge people. It will broaden the base. And it'll broaden the conversation. So let's talk about broadening the conversation. The one thing that we've been told you can't talk about are race, issues of race. There's got to be a safe space to have those conversations in our workplaces. Why? Because there are books out there, there's research out there that will tell you that is what holds people back, is the inability to talk about what matters to them, that their experiences are unique. Imagine being the only female in a group of 10 people choosing who's going to get the next job. How difficult that must be for that person. Imagine what it must be like to be one of 50 around a table that's very unique. For the first 2 years of my tenure, first 3 years, there was only one African-American secretary in the entire country. And it was me. And it was a very lonely place to be at a table of 50 of my peers. Not intentional, not hurtful, just lonely because of the reality of what that is. Everybody knows what it's like to be an outsider. Everybody likes to be an insider. And so until you broaden the conversation to make people feel comfortable, you're never going to bring them in to really start to change because they can give you perspectives that are different. And I don't know what that diversity is for you. I don't know what that diversity is for your organization or organizations around this country. The reality is there are people who should be in the room with you that are not today. Think about the issue of homelessness. Think about that. At every interchange in your city, you may have this issue of urban camping. We don't engage any of those folks in decision making around how best to serve them. We're going to give them the answer. And guess what? It's going to only get worse until we start to engage to say, what do you need? What can we do to help you? As opposed to giving them our answers. So that's the approach of what I'm suggesting. So I'm not adopting or encouraging you to pick your own single issue. Look at it for the uniquenesses of that issue. So when you broaden the conversation and you broaden the base of who you're engaged with, you're going to be making decisions that will validate and or encourage you to change things that are not right. And then you're going to empower people with those tools. So there's 6 commitments that I'm going to make, and then I will pass it on to Michelle to talk about some very specific issues. These are things that I'm asking members of DOTs around the country. I'm asking the private sector partners around the country to think about these things and implement them. Because if we can do these things, you can then build a future that's going to be more diverse, more equitable, and more inclusive. So, commit to an inclusive workforce, creating and maintaining an inclusive workforce with policies that embrace equity. If you can go out and find one person that's different than the core team members you have today, you're doing it. Because remember, the point of saying, I'm the first in 108 years means I can't expect this to change immediately. It's going to have to be a journey that we go on together. Think about creating programs in your workspace that maintain diversity and inclusion. Corporate America is doing it. If Google is doing it, if the big tech companies are doing it, the big finance companies are doing it, I am not an advocate to say government should run like a business, but there are principles in the private sector that can be employed in government. So creating a structured program. We do it for sexual harassment. We do it for violence in the workplace. We do it for all the technical things that we need to teach our employees and coworkers to do. We can do it for issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion as well. Building a training program to say everybody's not coming to us with the same skill set. The ability to tell good jokes and bad jokes, the ability to use language that you grew up with versus language that you need to use in the workspace. You can't afford to get rid of people who are making those mistakes, but you can train folks to be able to do that. That's an important thing to do. If you do those three things, you're going to build an environment that it's welcoming. And that environment will do what? Welcome other diversities, other people to the table, and you will start to address the issues of workforce. You're going to be allowing people to have a voice on issues. There's nothing an employee can't tell me on any issue any day of the week. There's a process. You may not like the answer, but you've got to engage in those discussions. And then last but not least, think about this in terms of fair treatment, in terms of promotions, in terms of hiring, in terms of assigning opportunities. In my engineering space, when we do design build, guess what? People, engineers, young professionals, they all want to get it. For the longest time, we were giving it to one person. We are intentional at our department of bringing new people to those tables, to those opportunities. And so I would ask you to do the same thing, is think about it from a fair treatment perspective. Is it fair to someone who didn't get it? To be able to manage it. Those are the ways that you change the diversity, the equity, and inclusion. So inclusive workforce, building programs to foster that environment, providing the tools and training and instruction for your employees to get better at it, both public sector and private sector, creating a fun environment that people feel comfortable to address these issues, giving your employees a voice so that they can not feel stifled, and last but not least, always adopting a fair treatment, recognizing that we all have biases. We all have our own little idiosyncrasies that point to imperfections. Challenge yourself to change those things. So with that, let me turn it over to Michelle to come on up. And actually, I think you got an introduction right quick. And then I look forward to some questions and discussions at the end of the panel.
Thank you, Dr. Wilson. Your perspective and insight are incredibly valuable. Next, I would like to introduce Michelle Howard of the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, where she is currently the Director of Small Business Programs. Ms. Howard is an Army veteran and has served in 4 wars. You heard that right, 4. Ask her about it later. She has over 30 years of experience in management, supervision, performance, inventory, and small business programs. This retired Maryland State of Transportation industry leader coaches and advises small and minority women-owned businesses on best practices, certification, and contracting opportunities. She's received numerous awards and is nationally recognized for her dedication and contributions to the small business community. So please join me in welcoming Michelle Howard.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Before I get started, I want to say a special thank you to Secretary Wilson. He's done an excellent job in giving that broad, definition that we need to look for when we start to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion and what it may look like. I also want to say thank you to the North Carolina Department of Transportation, especially the Diversity and Inclusion Public Relations Office, wanted to get that right, for reaching out. I really appreciate this opportunity. It feels good to be out amongst everyone and to be able to share information and to network and just really engage. So thank you. As you can see by the slide, WMATA's mission includes the equity and stimulating the economic economy. It does that for the development because it's important to the employees as well as our internal and external customers that they see the actions that's being taken to include DEI in all that we do every day. There is commitment from the top to the bottom, from the bottom to the top. And that's because it's taught throughout and it has to be continuous. It helps to make sure that all of our employees have the buy-in, meaning that they support your socio-economic programs, which stems from the diversity, equity, and inclusion and the actions that's being taken to see these throughout the agency or the organization. Then you have to ask yourself, as the secretary was saying, what does that look like? Because it's not going to look the same in every organization. The key word on this slide is removing roadblocks. Today I'm going to talk to you more specifically about the success and the importance of our social economic programs for our small businesses and how DEI plays such an important part for the success of those businesses, and everything that we do throughout the agency makes it an ongoing process. When you talk about DEI, you have to start with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VI. You talk about that because these were and still is, I'm not going to say were, it still is, those items that govern us when it comes to requirements, regulations, compliance, things that we see that has been put in place. So that's just the beginning. From an agency's perspective, when you follow your regulatory compliance and when defining equity, you must start with Title VI because it gave us the guidelines to put into play those policies and procedures that each of the agencies and/or companies and organizations will take. So then you think about how do we go beyond Title VI? So I wrote some notes here about transit equity is broader than just Title VI. Title VI focuses on avoiding disparate treatment, not addressing broader racial and social inequities. It focuses on current customers and our riders, not all of the residents of the region. It focuses on a limited set of measures and topics, and it responds to Metro's business decisions. So planning broader DEI takes you beyond these types of measures, and it focuses on more specific actions that should be taken. And you have to think that that's where it all begins. So, Title VI requirements include access to benefits. The listing should read as so in all of your policies and procedures. You should have your language access plan, public participation plan, complaint procedures, minority representations on your advisory boards, system-wide policies and procedures, your equity analysis, service monitoring, and major service changes that may take place in your transportation. You have your equal access through demonstrated rail and bus system-wide standards in your policies, your policy definitions for equity analysis, any type of major service change, a disparate impact on minorities, and any type of burden on your low-income persons. You have complaint procedures, public participation plans, and of course your LEP, Language Assistant Plan. When you talk about your customer demographics, for Metro, our bus riders are 80% people of color, 46% low income, 22% receive some type of transit subsidy. Our rail customers is 62% Caucasian, 49% high income, and 58% of them receive some type of transit subsidy. You draw from each department in your agency to look at areas that can be improved upon when it comes to the implementation of your DEI. You look and brainstorm on how can we make improvements upon what that looks like from the Title VI program in each department. Being an equitable employer and then having equitable transit systems, what does that actually look like? So for Metro, we have successfully compete for most of the best talent because it becomes a professional fulfillment with people's career goals, making sure that we have opportunities for growth and advancement. We make sure that Metro is well managed with low turnovers. It flows up and down and across our priorities, making sure that all of those are clear. All employees are fully engaged. They feel valued and they take pride. Our culture seeks diverse viewpoints, and we make sure that we feel value and take pride to be engaged. This includes our leadership and all staffing. We make sure that all employees feel safe and secure, so that psychologically, physically, they know that they can be accident-free. They know that the business plan is in place, and those items that fulfill implementing an ongoing DEI program can be balanced. We try to make sure that all customers feel appreciated. We have their needs met and would rather ride Metro than any other form. We try to have a seamless, safe, and secure, low-crime experience in North America. We have minimized the need for paratransit services because all of our systems now are sufficiently ADA accessible and friendly to customers with limited mobility. Metro's strategic roadmap. So, being an equitable employer plus equitable transit systems equals a successful equity toolkit. This toolkit is used to help to improve the equity for all of the customers, both internally and externally at Metro. We have the 3 concentrated areas for the employer and 6 in the transit areas. Having a DEI strategic roadmap unites and expands existing efforts by establishing goals, objectives, actions, and outcomes to proactively incorporate equity and inclusion in everyday practices. In FY21, our board's framework for transit equity focused on performance reporting, our policing, public engagement, fares and services, sustainability, contracting, to include equitable employer goals of workforce diversity, workplace inclusion, and contracting diversity and inclusion. Our equitable mobility provider of choice goals, we have to define and measure. We ensured public engagement and service. We looked at fares, invested in the infrastructure, and the policing. Yesterday, Manali Shah and Kay Meyer, they brought out the importance of having data and analytics. All of that insight on receiving data and analytics internally as well as externally helps you to start to plan and define what does diversity, equity, and inclusion look like in your agencies and or your companies. You need feedback from all of these entities to form that team to work on what those goals and objectives will be that you want to achieve to ensure it continues on a regular basis throughout your organization. Small business enterprise programs. This is the heart of the agency for me because I have oversight of these. So we have a broad objective for the programs, but the outcomes that we're looking for is to make sure that the goals are met, to ensure that certified businesses, the number that we have in our database, increase. So we set yearly goals on the number of certifications that we have and how often are we using those small businesses certified in those NAICS codes mostly utilized by WMATA. We also will look at those that are not utilized as often, and we say, so how can we make sure they get their foot in the door? And that's when we demonstrate smaller, low-hanging fruit types of opportunities to ensure that they get a piece of the business for WMATA. We also ensure that by adding DEI, we broaden the notification for forecasted opportunities. We remove barriers in solicitation practices. We provide education and training to ensure small and minority businesses have the competency to meet the demands of the procurement and strategic partnership opportunities. MBE and DBE program implementation and analysis. We make sure that we have diversity when it comes to our technical evaluation teams and our panels. And we consider diversity of all staff when it comes to the contracting as part of the agency's evaluation and selection criteria. We also are implementing a formal mentor-mentee program for the small businesses. The socioeconomic programs that you see on the slides are presently the programs that we have at Metro. We have 2 federally funded programs, the DBE, SBE, and I've recently implemented, as of November 1st, 2021, the MBE program, small business and micro programs for our locally funded opportunities. Our goal is 25% for our federal opportunities, and I'm so proud to say that we've achieved and went over the 25% goal for our small businesses. And believe me, that's never an easy task because you have to deal with race neutral as well as race conscious. The hardest part is race neutral, and the federal government looks at how well you do that when it comes to the achievement of your goals. That's part of the compliance that we have to oversee. When DEI is implemented throughout, it adds success to these types of programs because when the entire agency knows the importance of DEI, they support these programs more. The credit card holders, project managers, they take on ownership because it is not the job of one office to ensure the achievement of these types of goals. It is the entire agency's responsibility to ensure that the agency as a whole achieve the goals, to ensure that small businesses have an opportunity at every level to get contracts, to have some type of joint ventures, whatever it takes to involve them to show the livelihood of this is what we're doing locally in our region to ensure that those businesses have opportunities, as well as on the statewide in the DMV. We have work from DC, Maryland, and Virginia that combine all of what we do as far as our certifications in our database. So that all becomes important. In closing, I want to say thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. But please think about that DEI is just not a one and done. It takes time, but then you ask how much time do we have? We have all the time that has been given. So you take back information and you work on each department to see what does each department's Title VI look like first. And then how can we go beyond the requirements that we already know is in writing to meet and ensure that we're passing our Title VI for auditing? Go beyond that. Look at the department, not just the agency as a whole. Because the agency as a whole, okay, you can say, yep, we've got our assurances, everything with Title VI is done, all the checks off is there, we're ready for an audit. But when you dive deep into each department and see what does that look like, you're going to see that you're not there yet. So I want to say thank you. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Ms. Howard. That was a wonderful presentation. We have about 15 minutes left, maybe a little bit more than that. So let's first look at how you answered the poll question. Good to know. All right. I can actually not see the result there. Okay, there we go. Can the panel see the result? Does that answer surprise you, or no? No. So what you expected? Okay. Now we're going to open it up for questions from the audience. So does anybody have any questions for our panelists? Oh, come on! Don't be shy. Yes, please. Yes, she's gonna. Athena's gonna bring a microphone to you.
Thank you both for sharing your insights. I appreciated the contrasting definitions Dr. Wilson provided at the beginning of his presentation between equality and equity. I wondered if either of you could share some examples from our industry that would help demonstrate those differences.
That's a great question. It should be on.
Should be on?
Yep,
Okay.
there you go.
Yeah, so I think the easiest example I can give you is we offer additional assistance where necessary for some of our DBEs. So we have a consulting service. We actually have two. One is the Urban League. The other is an engineering firm. Historically, that engineering firm just got you in the door in terms of getting you certified. What we have found is a number of DBEs lose their certification because they were lacking some of the experience and or know-how to maneuver all of the requirements that are necessary to maintain their status. And so we found ourselves having to do a little extra work with that, and it created a little ripple with some of our primes because we didn't offer them that type of assistance, particularly when it comes to strategic planning, for example. When you look at contractors and you look at the work they do for us, it's very prescribed, very physical in nature. But with our DBE services, it was a little different. And so recognizing what we need them to get better at, we had some obligation to try and help them. And so in that situation, we weren't treating them equally, but we were providing equitable service. We saw a need and we helped elevate them so that they both could perform at their contracted levels. So that's one example that I can share with you that we've had. And there are others where, regions, for example, get treated differently. I've got one region in Shreveport where they have a great infrastructure system. It's probably the best network system in town. The reality is the folks who are going to be the big recipients of the money aren't those who have done their fair share. The money that we're going to see in the bridge program is going to go to those poorly structured or poorly maintained bridges, as opposed to the communities that have maintained their property. Ideally, you would want to reward those who've done their fair share. Likewise, those who haven't, there's a reason why they haven't invested, and there's a reason why their bridges are poor, and there's a reason why the federal government's giving us money to go do those bridges so that those communities can have access and mobility like those others that may not need our support. So that's another example of how dollars get spent differently, and that interpretation has value.
One of the biggest things that I can tell you right now for us, we just completed the Disparity Study. So for those of you who know results of a Disparity Study, that's extremely important. It tells you right there that the issues and the things that needs to be implemented and put in place because of the disparity, the lack of the diversity, equity, inclusion.
And I know there's a question, and while you get ready, I will tell you, when you look at Title VI, and I appreciate you pointing that out, when you go back and dig into the data, while I give you a really good number of improved DBE services, everyone is elevated, but when you dig deeper into it, you see that only 1.8% of it was African Americans. And when you look at the number of businesses that are certified, maybe not in the work that we do. And so I would love to see our federal government move to having not just a DBE goal, but a very specific goal that we have to achieve, because when you start to measure it, that's what you're going to work on. When you have accountability for it, that's what you're going to have to work on. So I appreciate your point about the disparity study, because every state is probably looking at those same numbers. Not that there's a problem with white women-owned businesses getting work. No, it's nothing at all. But let's look at it for what the numbers really show us to see where we ought to work. And just like we help that DBE firm from an equity standpoint to help them do better, we owe it to those other firms as well to help elevate them as well.
Great. Our next question?
I spoke to both of you earlier, and you know that I work for a national association, and we represent the state highway safety offices. We're not the DOT, but like so many organizations, our state highway safety offices have very rigorous grant-making processes, the steps they have to go through. So first a comment and then a question. The comment is, thank you for pointing out the need of making sure that it is equitable. We need to mentor. We need to develop training. We need to help these organizations that we need to be reaching, particularly in communities of color, understand the process. So my question is, the challenge that I hear from our state highway safety offices, how do we start the conversation? And Dr. Howard, you said this, I think, so eloquently when you made you pointed out about speaking with the homeless population, that we were going in and saying, here's the answer, versus how can we help you? And I often hear people say the government wants to come in and tell us what to do and not, talk to us about what do you need? How can we help you? So how do we do that better? How do we start that conversation?
I think you started with public engagement, first and foremost. I think providing data and statistics and facts, and then hitting folks right between the eyes with it. I will tell you, I've got one representative who calls, he's had 2 deaths in his district, and he wants the world to turn upside down. And I said, well, I've got 900 plus deaths this year around the entire state. That's 3 people per day on average in Louisiana that are dying on our roads. Then you say, look, you've got thousands of people, hundreds of people in your district that died from COVID. Let's not be emotional about one thing, but dig into the facts and share it. That's how you start the conversation. The challenge is keeping the conversation going after you do that. And I think you engage the public, you broaden the base, you go find those advocacy groups that really care about this issue and give them voice, because they're the ones that are not going to let an issue go away. There's a great debate right now in transportation, not a great debate, but it's a debate around pedestrians and bicyclists. That constituency is amazing in terms of their advocacy. It's a small group of people, but they're having huge impact because they're consistently carrying the message, and you need to not give up having that conversation. As Michelle said, you've been given all the time that you have. You either change or be changed in these positions of leadership. And so stay at it. It's not an easy thing to do. And we sometimes muck it up with government in terms of the process and bureaucracy, but you have to be consistent in that effort.
Good morning. My name is Nicole Giamma, and I'm program analyst in the Department of Transportation. And thank you all for everything that you've shared with us this morning. And I want to ask you, when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, when you want to look at best practices or creating models, is there a first place or a first step in terms of that you would suggest where agencies can start or should start to be successful and make sure that we are being diverse, inclusionary, and equitable?
If I understood your question correctly, I would always say you start with equity, right? You start with equity, and it makes it easier to then put in or bring in inclusion and your diversity. Equity is always at the forefront. As the Secretary had mentioned about equity, you can have an equity be an action that is taken by a company or organization that's easier to start to implement and develop, and then having those actions taken, then you can see clearly of what type of inclusion do we need, what type of diversity then do we need. So I would say start with equity.
I will take a different spin and tell you it starts with data and knowing where you have the greatest opportunity. I will tell you, if you look at the 4,200 people, we've got a pretty diverse department. But when you dig to the next level, you recognize that there's not much diversity when it comes to positions that pay the top 30% in our department. And so if I'm interested in really moving the needle, not just in terms of big numbers, I'm going to try and focus my energies on bringing in folks at the leadership position or moving people from that mid-level to a leadership position to really start to change that framework, because until you do that, we're more inclined to maintain our comfortable zone of what we have. And so regardless of the issue, if it's an equity issue, if it's a diversity issue, if it's your policies and procedures of excluding people unintentionally, I think you start with understanding what you're dealing with and find the best place to have a meaningful impact and an immediate win or an early win so that folks can see that change is possible.
May I add one little thing to that too, because I thought those are both great answers. I think that part of it is leadership and having leaders who see this, who are clear-eyed about what's happening. And obviously, the data is going to be the proof, right? And leading with equity can help open the eyes of people that might not be on board yet. And it might, people like things to be equal. They like that, and it gets their attention.
Equal is easy.
That's right. Equal is easy.
Equal is easy.
Equal is easy. So, but what I want to ask and get your thoughts on are when you're looking to make a big change and you're trying to get an agency or a department to really buy into what it is we're doing, what opportunities do institutions, what can they see manifested when priority is put on diversity and inclusion? Because I think it's great to put it out there what an agency can look like, right? What are the benefits to a successful diversity and inclusion?
I'll give you, it's the success of intentional decision making, I think. Mm-hmm. And they see things that can happen. When I became secretary, we have on our wall on the first floor an award named after a gentleman by the name of Charles Dunbar, and he helped create the civil service system in our state. And there are people on this wall that are held in such high esteem. The problem was there was maybe 4 women and no people of color on the wall. Well, for a large constituency in my building, females and people of color and other ethnic groups and international employees, they never saw themselves reflected in that. And so I took the position I wasn't going to submit any names until we had someone that was representative of who we are as a department today. Not criticizing those individuals, do it today. It's not easy to do that, but when you're intentional, we started to see more people be nominated. We started to see people think differently about it. I've been intentional on DBEs where we said, I'm just not going to sign a contract if there's no DBE participation on engineering selections in some cases. It took a while, and then when I started awarding contracts and making the point that I'm awarding a contract because they were inclusive or they exceeded the DBE goal, guess what? Firms started saying, if I want to do business, I'm going to do X. And so I think when you make those changes and you do that, people see that you can turn the ship. You can do better than what you were doing before. Not perfect, but better than what you were doing before. And so that's the best outcome, I think, of seeing what that looks like.
I would agree 100%, because when you are intentional, you get the best results when you're intentional. Because what it does, it wakes people up who are sleeping, right? It might piss them off or whatever, but it wakes them up. And it allows them to say that the leadership is making changes. I need to get on board. I need to make those type of changes. I need to look deeper into my department. I need to be intentional and show the leadership that I'm a part of what's taking place. Like, I'm not going to miss the train, right? And so I have to agree with that 100%. And it also goes back to what the Secretary said about the importance of having the data to actually show it when you start to dive deep.
And for the leaders, I will tell you, it's not easy. And when you do that, people will leave.
Mm-hmm.
People will not like it. And that's okay. I think you have to license people to leave sometimes, because I'd rather them leave if they can't buy into this than keep them and let them continue to infect the rest of the organization. And so you're not going to win everybody over. Mm-hmm. Slowly, it's when you're most uncomfortable that you change, or when when you're uncomfortable, you will vacate. So that's okay too. Don't assume that taking these steps and this intentionality is going to be easy, and that the organization is going to stay the same, that the culture, which is one of the most difficult things to change about this issue, is changing the culture, because it's the way we've always done it. It's not what you need. And so this gentleman's been waiting for a question, but I just had to get that part out, because we sometimes expect everything to be the same after we influence change.
It's okay. I was being patient to see if you actually answered my question. So appreciate the conversation, because I think this is where it really starts. My name is Chris Werner with North Carolina Department of Transportation. It's good to see you again, Dr. Wilson. A couple things that come to my mind anecdotally, and I'm thinking from a preliminary engineering professional services perspective. Anecdotally, what I've heard from private engineering firms is the DBE certification process is overly burdensome, and sometimes complicates their desire to even try to become certified as a DBE. So I think that's a challenge that I don't know that we're going to solve today, but I think it might be something for discussion. So one of the things we're looking at in North Carolina is, what's the incentive to be certified as a DBE? What is the carrot? And we're looking at strategies for that. When it comes to increasing small firm utilization, I look at it all across different categories. And given we're a race and gender neutral program, qualifications-based selection, we're actively looking at strategies to increase our firm utilization now. And we found that the first thing we need to do is we need to start truly tracking our data, prime and sub. And so we can look at all the individuals inside of the organization, all the individual units and divisions inside the organization, to see how we're doing. I think that's one of our first steps. I would be interested to see if any of the panels have any strategies that you at your agencies have employed to try to increase small firm, all the different certification levels, utilization inside of your organizations while maintaining a race and gender neutral program, qualifications based. Thank you.
That's a tough question, and it's a good question. I think creating, and we're attempting to do that when you look at what the Urban League is doing in terms of how they work with businesses and small organizations in the normal operation. And that's what we were hoping, and we're monitoring it to see if we see some changes in what that is, because we're comfortable with our program and we look at the basics. The program, I think, was designed and is relatively incomplete and ill thought out in some regards. We're saying you've got to be disadvantaged, and we've got to document and prove your disadvantaged status, as opposed to saying you're just diverse. meaning you're underrepresented in our workspace. And so going to where those entities are is one step. The other step is changing the standards by which we expect people to deliver, and we see that internally as well. You don't have to be an engineer to be a good project manager. You can actually align the work differently than the way we have been structured as organizations. We're not doing it in Louisiana, so I'm not saying that we're experts in that. I'm just saying I think there's an opportunity to think differently about what we expect and what we think qualifies, and if we were to modify some of those standards, I think it becomes easy. And I was very cautious to not say lower those standards, but to modify those standards, modify those requirements, modify those expectations. I think you will start to see a greater presence in your workforce from companies that can compete and participate and do when the system was built or designed for them not to. You see that with small engineering contracts. We tried to do that with small engineering firms. And then we said, well, you make too much money or you've got one too many engineers. Is small based on the number? Is it based on your workload? Is it based on your years of service? And we were smart enough in Congress and in policy-making positions to make it complex and difficult to where it didn't serve a purpose. And so I think that's really the best approach, or one approach to take, is to begin to modify what these rules of engagement are and expectations.
So when you were talking about the certification process, the certification process, of course, it's different by state, right? But let's see, there is a way, because we've done it, to simplify the process. Like we have workshops on the process where we take, the companies through each step of the application process. We do it in different languages to ensure that, we're not excluding some of the small businesses. We have partnered with DDOT Department, DC's Department of Transportation, to hold different workshops and things of that sort to try to meet companies where they are, to try to make sure that they're understanding the wording. What does that mean? What does that look like? We try to work with them on their financials. Part of the mentoring and helping them through some processes is how are they looking at their financials? Are they able to keep good financials? So those are some of the things that we are doing. And I always say we're meeting them where they are, right? The other thing is that when it comes to increasing the utilization, so the newly implemented minority small businesses programs and stuff that we've done is to ensure that the low-hanging fruit helps us to utilize a broader base of our small businesses that may not always get that opportunity. And that also includes credit cards, because I always say that's the low-hanging fruit. Those are the companies that we want to help to get their foot in the door. So this is when we work very closely with procurement and the program side on the dollar value criterias of our projects, right? Easing the bonding requirements on these projects, having training and classes that deals with bonding and how to get them certified to, be bonded and things of that sort. So it's that hands-on, I always say grassroots approach that we are presently taking to ensure that we can increase the utilization of our certified businesses.
Terrific. We have another question?
I just wanted to comment that thank you for this great discussion today. And much of your discussion or your presentation has been directed to those with the Department of Transportation or other state or municipal leaders, in the group. And there's probably some business owners in the group too, as I am. I'm a small business, a woman-owned engineering firm. Okay, and I'm one of the firms that have really prospered or benefited from the focus that our state and municipal leaders have put on diversity, and inclusion. I'm one of the benefactors of this. But it was about, I heard you use the word bold and intentional. And it was about 3 or 4 years ago, I was meeting with Ruth Jordan, who's the manager of the diversity group for the city of Charleston. And she used that term, bold and intentional. And she used it to me in the concept of, Judy, you need to be bold and intentional going out there and trying to get the work, right? But after leaving her, I've really given a lot of thought to this over these last few years, that as a business owner, as a business leader, who has benefited from these DBE programs and minority programs, I need to communicate that to my staff, so it can't just be a message that's directed to our state and municipal and all those leaders. We firms, small businesses, minority, woman-owned businesses, we're the benefactors of this, but it's upon us too to get this message out to our staff, that they need to look at this in a different perspective, a different culture. We need to be the leaders in communicating this to our staff, so it comes down to, that's really where we can make a broader difference in our country, right? We have to get it down to the individual level. And how do all of us in this room, we all have to be focused on that, because it's very easy to just be complacent. To just be complacent and say, well, yeah, I'm seeing some success because of these programs that DOT or the city of Charlotte or the city of Charleston or whatever, all the great support they throw at us. But what can we business leaders give back to that too? And I think that needs to be a real focus for each of us, for every one of us in the room. So.
I want to say thank you for that comment, because yes, it's so true. I always, when I have outreaches at Metro, I have smaller types of outreaches because I really want the opportunity for engagement with the small businesses, to hear those type of comments and what is it that my office can do to help. So one of the things that came to be is that we had smaller, what we call business to business meetings, right? Where we will have an appointment with a business and they can invite however many of their staff. And we talk about any type of processes. We talk about compliance. We talk about the different opportunities that we have coming up. We talk about what their struggles are, and we have that engagement with them because, as you're stating, it helps to bring all of them in the company on board, right? To hear it coming from the office and to know that these are the things that are being taken into consideration when we are trying to put projects out there for bid and everything. We look at contracts on a contract by contract basis to assess different type of goals, whether they're federal or not types of goals. And we are fighting for you when you don't know it. I always say, people don't know that we're marketing and fighting for you and you don't know it when it comes to small business. And that's why I love what I do so much, because I like to see the benefits, at least if one business more can just get their foot in the door and start being there front and center, it always helps out.
Yeah, the first word that came to my mind is what she said just now was thank you, because I think the reality is these programs, this work is so important, and it's always under assault in many circles. And I think it's ill-informed assault because they don't realize the real value of what this has done for not minority businesses or disadvantaged businesses, but small businesses. In terms of growing the economy, everybody's not going to be that big Fortune 500. And so talking about the success that you've had in the program with these services, with this opportunity, goes a long way in circles that misunderstand or don't understand or are threatened by this. Because that success story, people will tell you, and I mentioned this earlier, not out of any ill will toward those businesses. I want to see all of our firms that are in the program grow up and continue to do good work. There's one group that's doing exceptionally well. it's not understood that it's white female-owned businesses are doing great work because of this. The program works regardless of who's the beneficiary of it. It works, and so highlighting that is important. We're looking to, and we COVID threw us a little curveball there for a while, but we're going to get back to it this year to recognize not just the subs and the minority-owned firms that are doing good work and are gaining and growing, but also the primes that are working with them as an opportunity to say, which firm has done the most work with the most firms on our list? And let's celebrate that success. It's a recycling effort because they will continue to do more work. We're going to highlight and show them who you can talk to really get opportunities and not have the bad side of what we see, because there are those stories of contractors only going to one, and that one is going to be satisfied with what they're getting. And that ought not be the case. Opportunity ought to be limitless in terms of what we do. So I appreciate you sharing the story. I think that's the first step. And the second step, I think, is celebrating that success to educate that the program works. The efforts that we do work, and it changes communities. And I like the fact that you want to communicate that to your employees, because I think they sometimes miss the value of what we have done and what your business is doing and think it's just we're going to go design this project. It's more than that in terms of the institutional or structural change you're creating.
I also really appreciate your comment, and I want all of us in this room to remember that a diverse and inclusive small business, a diverse and inclusive agency, a diverse and inclusive community has more voices at the table. So that means there's more ideas coming in. That means you're better problem solvers. It means you're more productive. It means you've expanded your workforce, and your capacity of who's getting contracts, as well as people are happier. You're going to be able to retain people in that sort of community, and it makes an agency stronger. It makes a company stronger, and it certainly makes a community stronger. So please tell your employees, but also I'm talking to everybody. Like, there's a reason we're doing this, and it's for a stronger community. Does anybody else have any other questions? Yes, right there. Right. Thank you.
Oh,
Yep.
okay. I was going to say more of a thank you for this session. My name is Tanya Smith. I work at NCDOT in the Office of Civil Rights, and also chair our Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Advisory Council. So I really appreciate all the conversation and the best practices. And also, Secretary Wilson, I think that from your leadership standpoint in taking over on AASHTO, we can really help shape some policy for the DBE program that has been it's very outdated, very meaningful, but there's a lot of opportunities to grow the program by making policy changes. So I hope that under your leadership, we can work on some of those agenda items. But I thank you for all your best practices, Michelle, and all that you share with us. Spirit, got it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's important to think that we no longer, as transportation, have to deal with what we would normally fight with. How much money we're going to get? Are we going to get authorized? Those issues are now off the table. And it allows us an opportunity to focus on the how we do what we do and to really create that sustainable change. And so out of our Civil Rights Committee at AASHTO, we ought to be looking at how do you take and grow the program institutionally. And this isn't meant to be partisan in any way or political, but with the leadership you have in Washington that are going to think about these issues perhaps a little bit more aggressively than we've seen in the past, now is the time to address that, to say, what are those things that we can do differently in the program, and how do we offer policy changes that can be included in guidance, can be promulgated in new rules, such that this becomes an institutional thing. That's my most important thing, is if we look at it just as this moment to do these things, that these issues are important, we're going to fail. And so creating that pathway to that future is important, because when you see that unrest that's created, guess where they go? They go to our highways. They go to our bridges. We permeate everything in terms of life. When they destroy things and block it, it's our stuff. And so we have to demonstrate that. And the point I was going to make is, when you look at all these other agencies, if North Carolina is like Louisiana, all the other departments, the DOT is probably much more aggressive and much further along in this issue in terms of who we do business, how we do business, than most other agencies, in part because of Title VI, in part because of the volume of money that we get, and in part because of the relationships and the network that we have is so vast. And so we welcome those ideas. We welcome those best practices. And AASHTO is going to be a voice for that effort as long as I'm chairman and president. And I think that's where all of the organizations in our association are. It was before me that we passed a unanimous resolution addressing the issues of systemic racism that started off in very spontaneous form with CEOs, and it wasn't just the people of color, the women, that brought that conversation. And so that's very encouraging for me to know that I'm representing an organization that cares about these things on their own, that people who are different than I am walk into this room and want to talk and learn and grow and get better at what this is. So that says a lot about who we are as an industry, and we should be very proud of that.
That's an excellent way to end this. We really appreciate you both coming. So can we give everybody, can we give them a hand? Thank you. Well, it's lunchtime. That's great. Remember, after lunch, we have another session. It's a policymaker roundtable. It's just going to rain for a while. The snow is not coming until like 9. You're fine. But during lunch, please visit our vendors and please wear your masks. And thank you so much for attending.